June 26, 1973. A phone rings in a New York office. The agent who answers listens for a moment. Then his face turns white. Frank Matthews, America's biggest drug boss, has disappeared. Gone, along with his teenage girlfriend, Cheryl Denise Brown, and $15 to $20 million in cash. That's more money than most people could imagine in 1973. Today, it would be worth over $130 million. Over 50 years later, he's never been found. Nobody discovered in a grave. No trace of his money found in a foreign bank. No confession before death. No answers at all. This is the story of the man they called Black Caesar. And he's the only major drug boss in American history who truly got away. Before we dive into one of the greatest mysteries in American crime history, I want to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Drop your city and the time in the comments below. Are you getting ready for bed in New York? Maybe it's 3 a.m. in London and you can't sleep. Let me know. And if you're ready for the full story of Frank Matthews, the man who outsmarted the Mafia, the D, and the FBI, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is going to be a journey. Like this video if you're ready to hear about the smartest criminal who ever lived. Before we go deeper, understand this. Frank Matthews was different from every other name you've heard. More successful than Frank Lucas, who inspired the movie American Gangster. More powerful than Nicky Barnes, who once appeared on the cover of the New York Times magazine. Smarter than all of them put together. While they died in prison or witness protection, their empires fell apart. Frank Matthews simply disappeared, and no one has seen him since. Now, let's go back to where it all started. The story begins not in the tall buildings of New York or the drug-filled streets of 1970s America, but in Durham, North Carolina, February 13, 1944. World War II was still happening across Europe and the Pacific. America was about to go through big changes, though the full civil rights movement was still more than 10 years away. In the segregated South, a child was born who would grow up to challenge not just the laws of the land, but the entire system of organized crime in America. Frank Larry Matthews entered a world of limited possibilities. Durham in the 1940s was a city sharply divided by race. The tobacco industry controlled the economy. Black Americans were stuck with the hardest, lowest-paying jobs with almost no chance of moving up. The separate but equal rule was still the law. Though everyone understood, there was nothing equal about it. Black children went to underfunded schools. Black families lived in certain neighborhoods, not allowed in others by both tradition and law. The American dream seemed reserved only for white Americans. Frank Matthews would remember very little of his early childhood. What memories he kept were mostly painful ones. When he was only 4 years old, his mother died. The exact details of her death remain unclear. Lost to time and poor record-keeping of black families in the segregated South. But the impact on young Frank was deep and lasting. Losing a mother at such a young age creates a wound that never fully heals. A hole that shapes everything that follows. After his mother's death, Frank went to live with his aunt, Marzella Steele. This situation contained a strange twist that would not be lost on Matthews in later years. Marzella was married to a Durham police lieutenant, a man who represented law and order in a segregated society that offered little justice to people who looked like Frank, growing up in the household of a police officer while holding the seeds of future crime created a unique situation. Young Frank learned early how law enforcement thought, how they worked, what they looked for, and what they missed. In those early years, classmates and family members called him Pee-wee because he was small. He was not physically imposing as a child, but those who knew him remembered something else, an intensity in his eyes, a quickness of mind that set him apart. He went to East End Elementary School, walking those segregated streets of Durham, where every part of life reminded him of his place in society. The school system failed Frank Matthews. Or perhaps he failed it. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. He was intelligent. Everyone agreed on that. But the education offered to black children in 1950s, Durham was inadequate at best. The textbooks were hand-me-downs from white schools, often outdated by 10 years or more. The facilities were worse. The teachers, though often dedicated, worked with limited resources. For a boy already dealing with the pain of losing his mother and the restricted opportunities of segregated America, sitting still in a classroom must have seemed pointless. Frank Matthews dropped out of school in the 7th grade. He was barely a teenager, but he'd already decided that normal paths to success were close to him. He could see the ceiling above black men in Durham, the jobs they could have, the neighborhoods they could live in, the life they could hope for. It was a ceiling that seemed impossible to break through, held in place by centuries of systematic oppression. What followed was perhaps expected. A young black boy in the segregated South, poor, without strong parental guidance, disconnected from education. The system seemed designed to push him toward trouble. Frank began hanging out with the wrong crowd. Or perhaps they were the only crowd available to him. He got into fights. He stole. He challenged authority at every turn. The anger of abandonment mixed with the rage of racial injustice, creating a dangerous combination. The juvenile justice system of 1950s North Carolina had little patience for troubled black youth, and even less interest in helping them improve. When Frank's bad behavior got worse, he was sent to a juvenile detention facility in Raleigh. For many young people, such an experience might have been a warning, a wake-up call to straighten out their lives. For Frank Matthews, it was simply another classroom, one where he learned different lessons than those taught at East End Elementary. In the juvenile facility, Frank met other young men from similar backgrounds, all of them victims of a system that offered few real opportunities. He learned about the underground economy that thrived in the shadows of the legal one. He heard stories of men who had found ways around the system, who refused to accept the limitations placed upon them by a white supremacist society. He also learned about violence, how to use it, how to defend against it, how to threaten it, without always needing to follow through. Most importantly, Frank Matthews learned patience and calculation. He was not naturally violent the way some of his fellow detainees were. He did not enjoy causing pain for its own sake. But he recognized that in the world he lived in, the credible threat of violence was a form of power. He began to develop the skills that would later define his criminal career. The ability to read people, to assess situations quickly, to think several steps ahead, to present different faces to different audiences. When Frank Matthews left the detention facility and returned to Durham, he was older, harder, and more determined than ever. The conventional society had nothing to offer him. But he was also smarter about how he would navigate the world. The openly rebellious teenager had begun his transformation into someone more calculating, more dangerous, because he thought before he acted. Durham made Matthews restless. He was ambitious in ways that the tobacco city could never satisfy. As a teenager in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he began to hear stories about Philadelphia, about New York, about the great northern cities where black Americans had moved during and after World War II in search of better opportunities. These cities were far from racial paradises. Segregation existed there too, often enforced by custom rather than law. But it was different, more flexible. A smart, ambitious young man might find opportunities there that would never exist in Durham. Frank Matthews moved to Philadelphia while still in his teens. The city was a revelation. Philadelphia in the early 1960s was a major city, a city of neighborhoods, each with their own character and hierarchy. South Philadelphia was controlled by Italian-American organized crime families. North Philadelphia had large black communities where an underground economy flourished alongside the legal one. West Philadelphia was changing, transforming as white residents fled to the suburbs and black families moved in to fill the space. Matthews needed a legitimate cover, a way to explain his income and activities. He chose barbering, a traditional trade in black communities and one that offered certain advantages for a young man interested in the underworld. Barbershops in black neighborhoods were more than just places to get a haircut. They were social centers, information exchanges, places where deals were made and news was shared. A barber heard everything, saw everyone, and held a respected position in the community. Frank Matthews set up his chair and began cutting hair, but his real education was happening in the conversations around him. Philadelphia's illegal numbers racket was a massive operation, a lottery system that existed decades before stake-run lotteries. Poor and working-class people, denied access to legitimate investment opportunities, placed small bets on three-digit numbers, hoping for a big payout. The odds were terrible, but hope is a powerful thing, and the numbers game supplied it cheaply. The numbers racket was organized crime, but it was different from other rackets in one crucial way. It required extensive community involvement and trust. Numbers runners collected bets from regular customers, often people they'd known for years. The bankers who backed the numbers needed to have enough capital to pay out when someone won, and they needed enough legitimacy to keep customers coming back. It was a business that required both criminal boldness and business smarts. Frank Matthews started at the bottom, running numbers for established operators. He was on time, reliable, and most importantly, he never stole. This last quality was crucial. Numbers runners handled other people's money every day, and the temptation to skim was enormous. Many runners gave into it and found themselves beaten or killed as a result. Matthews understood that short-term theft would destroy long-term opportunities. He was playing a longer game. As he ran numbers and cut hair, Matthews began to understand the structure of Philadelphia's criminal underworld. The Italian Mafia families controlled most of the serious rackets: loan sharking, labor racketeering, and most importantly, drug distribution. Black criminals could operate numbers games and some prostitution, but the heroin trade, which was becoming increasingly profitable in the 1960s, was firmly under Italian control. This struck Matthews as both unfair and inefficient. The Italian mobsters weren't selling heroin in their own communities. They were selling it primarily in black neighborhoods. Black dealers were doing the dangerous work of street-level distribution, while the Italian suppliers took most of the profits. It was, Matthews realized, another form of economic exploitation, not so different from the sharecropping system in the South or the limited job opportunities that kept black Americans in poverty. But unlike racial segregation, which was enforced by law and custom and the full weight of American society, the Mafia's control of drug distribution was maintained only by organization and violence. Matthews began to think, what if someone could offer a better product at a better price? What if someone could go around the Mafia entirely and establish direct connections with suppliers? These were dangerous thoughts. The Italian Mafia had killed men for less. They viewed the drug trade as their exclusive territory, and they enforced their control ruthlessly. But Frank Matthews was starting to realize something that would define his entire criminal career: rules. Even rules enforced by violence could be broken by someone smart enough and bold enough to think differently. During his time in Philadelphia, Matthews stayed mostly clear of serious legal trouble. He had minor run-ins with police, the kind of brushes with law enforcement that were almost unavoidable for a young black man in a major city, but nothing that resulted in serious prison time. This was crucial. While many of his peers were cycling in and out of jail, getting long criminal records that would later be used to put them away for life. Matthews was learning, watching, and building relationships. He made connections with other young men involved in the underground economy. Some were numbers runners like himself. Others were into different rackets. A few were already dabbling in drugs, working for Italian suppliers or running small-scale marijuana operations. Matthews listened to them all, absorbing information like a sponge, beginning to see the full map of organized crime in Philadelphia and beyond. The barbershop remained his base of operations, his legitimate cover. But increasingly, it was just that, a cover. His real attention was focused on understanding how money moved through the illegal economy, how drugs came into the city, how the Italian families maintained their control, and most importantly, where the weak points in their system might be. By the mid-1960s, Frank Matthews was ready to make his move. Philadelphia had taught him much, but it was also too small for his ambitions and too firmly under Italian control. There was another city, larger and more chaotic, where opportunities might exist for someone willing to take enormous risks. New York City was calling. When Frank Matthews arrived in Brooklyn in the mid-1960s, he was in his early 20s, young, ambitious, and relatively unknown. Brooklyn was a city unto itself, a borough of neighborhoods, each with their own identity. Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownsville, East New York. These were neighborhoods where Black and Puerto Rican families struggled to make ends meet, where poverty and limited opportunities created fertile ground for the drug trade. The heroin epidemic was accelerating. Returning Vietnam veterans brought back addictions formed in Southeast Asia. Inner-city residents turned to drugs to escape the grinding poverty and limited horizons of ghetto life. And the Italian Mafia families controlled the supply chain from beginning to end. They imported heroin from Europe and Turkey, processed it, and then sold it to Black and Puerto Rican distributors at marked-up prices. Those distributors took the risks of street-level dealing, while the Italian suppliers remained relatively protected from law enforcement. Matthews saw the system clearly, and he saw its inherent inefficiency and injustice. But seeing a problem and solving it are two different things. The Mafia didn't just have a monopoly on supply. They had organization, political connections, and the willingness to use extreme violence against anyone who challenged their control. Taking them on would require more than ambition. It would require a revolutionary approach to the drug business itself. In 1965, at the age of 21, Frank Matthews made a decision that would change his life and ultimately transform the structure of drug trafficking in America. He decided to go into the heroin business, but not as another black dealer buying from Italian suppliers. He would build his own supply chain, connecting directly with international sources, cutting out the Mafia middlemen entirely. This was audacious to the point of seeming impossible. Matthews had no international connections, limited capital, and he was challenging organized crime families that had been in operation since the 1920s. What he did have was intelligence, charisma, and an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. He also had something else, timing. The late 1960s represented a unique moment in the history of drug trafficking. The traditional French connection route that had supplied much of America's heroin was beginning to break down under increased law enforcement pressure. New sources were emerging in Latin America. The rigid hierarchies of the Mafia families were showing their age, making them less flexible and slower to adapt than younger, hungrier operators. And most importantly, the Italian Mafia had become complacent, secure in their control of the trade. Matthews began making trips outside the country. The details of exactly how he established his initial international connections remain murky. These were not the kinds of transactions documented in contracts or business filings. But gradually, patiently, Matthews built relationships with suppliers in Venezuela, Cuba, and eventually with Corsican traffickers who had their own sources in Southeast Asia. The key was offering something the traditional, mafia-controlled supply chain didn't: better prices for better quality. Matthews could offer this because he was cutting out multiple layers of middlemen. He bought directly from suppliers and sold directly to distributors. His margins were tighter, but his volume was enormous and growing. Drug dealers across America's inner cities began to hear about a new supplier who offered a better product at better prices, and Matthews's reputation grew. Of course, reputation alone wouldn't protect him from the mafia's response. Matthews knew that his very existence as an independent major supplier was a threat to their entire system. If he could do it, others would try. The mafia couldn't allow that precedent. They would move against him, either through violence or by applying pressure through their law enforcement and political connections. Matthews prepared for this. He built his organization not as a traditional hierarchical structure, but as a decentralized network. He had trusted lieutenants in different cities who operated with significant independence. If one part of the network was taken down, the rest could continue operating. He also made sure to spread the benefits of his operation widely. The dealers who bought from him made more money than they had buying from mafia suppliers. This gave them a personal interest in Matthews' success and created a broad base of support throughout the black underworld. He also invested in protection of a different kind. Matthews began making payments to corrupt police officers, customs officials, and others whose cooperation he needed. This wasn't particularly innovative. The mafia had been bribing officials since Prohibition, but Matthews did it smarter. He didn't create a long paper trail of regular payments. He made his bribes irregular and unpredictable, harder for investigators to track. Perhaps most importantly, Matthews cultivated a reputation for intelligence and restraint. Unlike some dealers who were quick to resort to violence, Matthews preferred to solve problems through other means. This made him less likely to attract the kind of attention that came from bodies piling up. When violence was necessary, it was calculated and purposeful, never random or excessive. By the late 1960s, Matthews was no longer just another drug dealer. He was becoming something unprecedented in American organized crime, a black man running a truly major interstate drug trafficking operation independent of Italian Mafia control. His success was about to accelerate dramatically. By 1968, Frank Matthews' operation had evolved from a promising startup into something genuinely formidable. He established his headquarters in Brooklyn, but his reach extended far beyond New York's 5 boroughs. Matthews understood something that many criminals, even successful ones, never grasped. The drug business was fundamentally a business, and it needed to be run with the same attention to logistics, finance, and organization as any legitimate enterprise. His distribution network began to sprawl across the eastern United States like a vast spider web. Philadelphia, where he'd first learned the criminal trade, was an early and important hub. Baltimore, with its deep poverty and thriving drug culture, became another crucial market. Washington, D.C., where contradictions of wealth and poverty existed side by side, proved enormously profitable. Boston's black neighborhoods provided another outlet for his product. But Matthews's ambitions extended far beyond the East Coast. He established operations in Detroit, where the automotive industry's decline was creating economic desperation perfect for drug market expansion. Chicago, America's second city, with its large black population concentrated on the south and west sides, became another Matthews stronghold. Even Los Angeles, 3,000 miles from his Brooklyn base, fell within his network. The scale of Matthews's operation was staggering. He moved heroin and cocaine through 21 states, not small amounts, but tons of product flowing through his distribution network annually. The revenue was proportional to the scale, over $100 million per year, an almost incomprehensible sum for the late 1960s and early 1970s. To put it in perspective, that would be equivalent to over $700 million in today's money. What made Matthews' network different from other drug operations wasn't just its size, but its organization. He ran his empire like a corporation. Each regional distributor operated with significant independence, but within clear guidelines. They bought product from Matthews at agreed-upon prices, sold it in their territories, and kept a percentage of the profits. Matthews handled the international supply side, used his connections to facilitate transportation, and provided the capital and organizational framework that made large-scale operations possible. Communication was crucial and dangerous. Matthews couldn't exactly use Western Union or pick up the phone without worrying about wiretaps. He developed a system of trusted couriers who carried messages between cities. He used coded language when phone conversations were unavoidable. He met with his key distributors face-to-face at regular intervals, rotating locations to avoid establishing patterns that law enforcement might detect. The money was its own challenge. $100 million in annual revenue, even after expenses and payments to distributors, left Matthews with an enormous amount of cash that needed to be cleaned. Unlike today, when electronic banking makes money laundering simultaneously easier and more traceable, Matthews dealt with physical currency, literal bags and suitcases full of cash. Las Vegas became his primary washing machine. The casinos in the early 1970s were much less regulated than they would become in later decades. Matthews made regular trips to Nevada, where he would gamble large amounts, lose some, win some, and walk away with casino checks that could be deposited in banks. The losses were a cost of doing business, a tax paid for the privilege of converting dirty money into clean. He also invested in legitimate businesses. Real estate was a favorite. Apartment buildings, commercial properties, legitimate fronts that generated paperwork supporting income. Some of this property was in his own name, some in the names of relatives or trusted associates. Matthews understood that successful criminals needed to create a legitimate financial identity that could explain their lifestyle. And what a lifestyle it was! Frank Matthews lived like royalty, or at least like his vision of what successful men should live like. He maintained multiple residences, including a mansion on Staten Island, where his wife and 3 children lived. The Staten Island home was his legitimate front, the place where he played the role of successful businessman with a wife and kids, living the American dream. But Matthews also maintained other properties, places where he could be himself, where he could live the lifestyle his drug empire funded. These were luxury homes filled with expensive furniture and artwork. He wasn't trying to blend in. He was making a statement about his success, his power, his refusal to accept the limitations that American society had tried to place on him as a black man. His garage looked like a luxury car dealership. Multiple Cadillacs, Mercedes-Benz sedans, sports cars that turned heads on the street. In the early 1970s, these weren't just expensive cars. They were symbols of having made it, of success and power. For a black man to drive such vehicles in that era was a statement, a challenge to anyone who thought they knew where black people belonged. Matthews dressed impeccably, custom-tailored suits in the latest styles, fine Italian leather shoes, jewelry that managed to be expensive without being gaudy. His personal style was sophisticated, businesslike, unlike some criminals who wore lots of gold chains and flashy rings. Matthews dressed more like a corporate executive or a successful entertainer. He wanted to project success and intelligence, not street corner flashiness. He attended major sporting events, sitting in prime seats at Madison Square Garden for Knicks games or boxing matches. These were places to see and be seen, events where New York's elite gathered. And Matthews made sure he was visible. He was not hiding his success. He was celebrating it, rubbing it in the face of a society that had told him he should be grateful for whatever scraps were thrown his way. Las Vegas trips were regular occurrences, sometimes for money laundering purposes, but often just for entertainment. Matthews enjoyed the casinos, the shows, the atmosphere of a city built on vice and excess. He gambled large amounts, tipped generously, and made sure everyone knew Frank Matthews was in the house. Yet for all his flash, Matthews maintained a certain discretion that set him apart from other criminals of his era. He wasn't giving interviews to newspapers or drawing unnecessary attention to himself. He enjoyed his wealth, but he was strategic about how he displayed it. This restraint would serve him well, keeping him lower profile than peers like Nicky Barnes, who seemed to court media attention. Frank Matthews lived a double life that would have been difficult for most people to maintain, but he managed it with apparent ease. On Staten Island, he was a family man. His wife and 3 children knew him as a successful businessman, an import-export trader, perhaps something vague enough to explain irregular hours and frequent travel, but legitimate enough not to raise too many questions. Did his wife know the truth? This remains one of the mysteries surrounding Matthews. Some accounts suggest she was willfully ignorant, choosing not to ask questions about the source of their comfortable lifestyle. Others suggest she knew, but accepted it as the price of security and luxury. Matthews kept his family life and his criminal enterprise carefully separated, never discussing business at home, never bringing associates around his wife and children. But Matthews had another relationship that was far less discreet. Cheryl Denise Brown was young, barely out of her teens when Matthews, then in his late 20s, began his relationship with her. She was beautiful, ambitious, and unlike his wife, fully aware of and involved in Matthews's real business. Cheryl was his mistress, his companion for his other life, the one who accompanied him to nightclubs and parties, who traveled with him and shared the excitement of his criminal empire. The relationship between Matthews and Cheryl Denise Brown would prove crucial to his story. But in these early years, she was simply another aspect of his complicated life. He maintained both relationships, both households, moving between them the same skill he used to manage his criminal organization. It required enormous energy and no small amount of deception, but Matthews made it work. He also cultivated relationships with corrupt officials at every level. Airline stewardesses who could carry packages without inspection, customs officials who knew when to look away, police officers who provided tips about investigations, politicians who could make problems disappear. These relationships were transactional, but carefully maintained. Matthews paid well and on time, and he never asked for more than his contacts could safely provide. Within his organization, Matthews was known as fair but demanding. He expected loyalty and competence from his distributors and lieutenants. Those who performed well were rewarded generously. Those who stole or compromised operations faced consequences, sometimes final ones. Matthews didn't micromanage. He hired smart people and let them do their jobs. But he expected results. His ability to maintain loyalty in an industry notorious for betrayal was one of his greatest strengths. Drug dealing attracts ambitious, often ruthless people who are always looking for an angle. Yet Matthews kept his network together, kept people working for him rather than against him. He did this through a combination of generosity, making sure his people prospered, and calculated displays of power that reminded everyone what happened to those who betrayed him. What made Frank Matthews's operation revolutionary wasn't just its size, but its structure. Before Matthews, the drug trade in America followed a relatively simple pattern. International suppliers, usually European or Turkish, sold to Italian Mafia families, who sold to mid-level distributors, who sold to street dealers, who sold to users. Each layer added markup, and each layer took risk. Matthews collapsed this structure. He went directly to international suppliers, cutting out multiple layers of middlemen. This allowed him to offer better prices while still maintaining healthy profit margins. His distributors made more money buying from Matthews than they had buying from mafia-controlled suppliers. This economic advantage was more powerful than any amount of muscle. His supply chain was diversified. Unlike operations that relied on a single source or a single route, Matthews had multiple suppliers in multiple countries and multiple methods of getting product into the United States. If one supply line was stopped by law enforcement, others continued functioning. This backup system made his network resilient in ways that more centralized operations were not. Matthews also understood the importance of quality control. Heroin of inconsistent purity was dangerous. Too weak and customers were disappointed. Too strong and they overdosed. Both outcomes were bad for business. Matthews ensured that his product was consistently high quality, properly cut to appropriate strength. This reliability made dealers prefer his product over alternatives. The distribution network operated on credit, and trust necessarily so, given that contracts couldn't be enforced in courts. Matthews would front large quantities of drugs to trusted distributors who would sell the product and then pay Matthews his share. This required enormous trust on both sides. The distributor had to trust that Matthews wouldn't send inferior product or short the quantity. Matthews had to trust that the distributor wouldn't take the drugs and disappear or claim they'd been robbed. This trust-based system worked because Matthews was smart about who he did business with, and because he enforced agreements strictly. Distributors knew that stealing from Matthews was not just wrong, but suicidal. The few who tried were made examples of, their fates serving as cautionary tales to others who might be tempted. Matthews also understood the importance of intelligence. He didn't just react to law enforcement pressure. He tried to stay ahead of it. His network of corrupt officials provided information about upcoming raids, ongoing investigations, and which agencies were focusing on which targets. This intelligence allowed Matthews to adjust operations, sometimes moving products and money hours before law enforcement arrived to seize them. The sophistication of Matthews's operation in the late 1960s and early 1970s was genuinely ahead of its time. He was running an interstate criminal enterprise with the efficiency and organization of a Fortune 500 company. He had distribution networks, supply chain management, quality control, financial systems for money laundering, intelligence gathering, and human resources management. It was corporate crime on a scale America had rarely seen from an independent operator. By 1970, Frank Matthews had built something unprecedented, a black-owned criminal empire that rivaled the Italian Mafia in scope and exceeded it in efficiency. He had proven that the old racial hierarchies of organized crime could be challenged and overcome. But his success was also making him a target, both for law enforcement and for the Mafia families whose monopoly he had shattered. The stage was set for Matthews's most audacious move yet, one that would cement his legend and accelerate his downfall, organizing the major black drug dealers of America to formally break with the Italian Mafia and establish themselves as independent operators with their own international connections. In 1971, Frank Matthews did something so bold that it still astonishes crime historians half a century later. He organized a summit meeting of major African American and Hispanic drug traffickers from across the United States. The meeting took place in Atlanta, Georgia, a city that was becoming increasingly important as the cultural and economic capital of Black America. The purpose of this summit was revolutionary. Matthews wanted to unite Black and Hispanic dealers to break the Italian Mafia's stranglehold on heroin importation and create their own independent supply networks. It was, in effect, a declaration of independence from the organized crime families that had controlled drug trafficking in America for decades. The audacity of this cannot be overstated. The Italian Mafia had been America's dominant organized crime force since Prohibition. They had political connections reaching into the highest levels of government. They had proven themselves willing and able to use extreme violence to maintain their power. They had infiltrated unions, controlled politicians, and operated with relative impunity for generations. The idea that black drug dealers, most of whom had come from poverty and had none of the Mafia's institutional advantages, could challenge this power structure seemed absurd. But Matthews saw what others missed. The Mafia's strength was also its weakness. Their organizations were hierarchical, traditional, slow to adapt to changing circumstances. They were insular, recruiting primarily from Italian-American communities, which limited their flexibility. And most importantly, they were complacent. For decades, the Mafia had controlled drug importation without serious competition. They had become lazy, comfortable with their monopoly profits. Matthews, by contrast, represented a new model of organized crime. He was younger, more adaptable, and willing to work across racial and ethnic lines in ways the Mafia could not or would not. He had already proven that direct international connections were possible and profitable. Now he wanted to help other black dealers follow his example. The Atlanta Summit brought together some of the most significant drug traffickers in America. These were not street corner dealers, but major operators, men who controlled distribution in entire cities or regions. Some were skeptical of Matthews's plans. Going against the Mafia seemed like suicide. Others were enthusiastic, seeing an opportunity to dramatically increase their profits by cutting out the Italian middlemen. Matthews presented his vision with the confidence of someone who had already succeeded. He explained his international connections, showed how direct sourcing could double or triple profits, and outlined a cooperative approach where multiple dealers could share intelligence, resources, and connections. He wasn't proposing a formal organization that would make them too easy a target, but rather a loose alliance of independent operators who helped each other when it served their mutual interests. The D and FB, I knew the meeting was happening. They had surveillance outside the venue, taking photographs of attendees, noting license plates and hotel registrations. But they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. The idea that black drug dealers were organizing on this scale, with this level of sophistication, challenged their preconceptions about who organized criminals were and how they operated. The Atlanta Summit was both a success and a disaster for Matthews. On one hand, he succeeded in rallying major dealers to his vision. Connections were made, information was shared, and several attendees began pursuing their own direct supplier relationships. Matthews's network expanded, his influence grew, and the Mafia's monopoly continued to erode. On the other hand, Matthews had made himself impossible for law enforcement to ignore. Before Atlanta, he was a known dealer, certainly, but one among many. After Atlanta, he was recognized as a major organizer of drug trafficking, someone coordinating activities across state lines, someone who needed to be taken down as a priority. The summit had raised his profile in exactly the ways he should have avoided. The Italian Mafia families also took notice. They began to realize that Frank Matthews wasn't just another dealer trying to grab a larger slice of the pie. He was attempting to kick over the entire table. Their response was predictable. They began planning how to eliminate him, either through violence or by using their law enforcement connections to pressure authorities into action. Following the Atlanta Summit, Matthews accelerated his efforts to establish and strengthen international supply connections. He traveled frequently to Latin America, meeting with suppliers in Venezuela who could provide cocaine and connect him to other sources. These weren't casual business trips. They were dangerous negotiations with people who were themselves violent criminals, people who had no particular loyalty to Matthews and every incentive to cheat or rob him if they sensed weakness. Matthews survived these negotiations through a combination of careful preparation, projected confidence, and making sure everyone profited from doing business with him. He paid on time, never tried to renegotiate deals after the fact, and built a reputation as someone who could be trusted to honor agreements. In the criminal underworld, where contracts couldn't be enforced through courts, reputation was everything. His Cuban connections were particularly valuable. Cuba in the early 1970s was a complicated place for drug trafficking. The Castro government officially opposed drug trafficking, but elements within Cuba, particularly those involved in intelligence operations, were willing to facilitate drug shipments in exchange for hard currency and information. Matthews navigated these complicated relationships carefully, never getting so deeply involved that he became a political liability. The Corsican connections were perhaps his most valuable. The French connection had been broken by aggressive law enforcement action, but Corsican organized crime groups still had access to heroin from Southeast Asia. They were looking for new markets and new partners after their traditional mafia customers became unreliable due to law enforcement pressure. Matthews offered them a new, reliable American customer with the capital and network to move massive quantities. These international relationships gave Matthews something unique among American criminals: genuine independence from domestic suppliers. The mafia couldn't threaten to cut him off because he wasn't buying from them. They couldn't pressure his suppliers because his suppliers were thousands of miles away and operated in different countries with different power structures. Matthews had genuinely broken free of the old system. In 1972, Matthews organized a follow-up meeting in Las Vegas. If the Atlanta summit had been about declaring independence, Las Vegas was about cementing it. This meeting was more focused, bringing together key distributors and discussing concrete operational details. How to coordinate shipments, how to share intelligence about law enforcement activities, how to handle disputes without resorting to violence that would attract attention. Las Vegas was chosen deliberately. The city was a natural gathering place for criminals and legitimate business people alike. People came and went constantly, making surveillance more difficult. The casino culture provided cover for large cash transactions, and the atmosphere of excess and indulgence fit Matthews's lifestyle perfectly. But Matthews was getting careless. Or perhaps more accurately, his success was making discretion impossible. He was too big, too visible, moving too much money and product to remain below law enforcement's radar. At the Las Vegas summit, he gambled openly in casinos, throwing around money in ways that attracted attention. He was photographed by surveillance teams. His associates were identified and added to growing case files. After the Las Vegas meeting, federal authorities received permission to wiretap Matthews's phones. This was a significant escalation. Getting wiretap authorization required convincing a judge that Matthews was engaged in ongoing criminal activity and that conventional investigative techniques had proven insufficient. The approval of wiretaps meant that the full weight of federal law enforcement was now focused on taking Frank Matthews down. The wiretaps revealed the scope of his operation in ways that surveillance and informants could not. Coded conversations about shirts and packages were decoded to reveal massive drug shipments. Phone numbers led to associates across the country. Financial discussions revealed money laundering operations. Slowly, methodically, federal prosecutors began building a case that would be impossible for Matthews to beat in court. The Italian Mafia families were losing millions of dollars because of Matthews's network. Dealers who had once bought from Mafia suppliers exclusively now bought from Matthews at better prices. The entire economic structure of the drug trade was shifting, and the old guard didn't like it one bit. Their first response was intimidation. Associates of Matthews received threats. Some were beaten. The message was clear: go back to buying from Mafia suppliers or face consequences. But Matthews's network held firm, primarily because they were making so much more money with Matthews than they ever had with the Mafia. Economic incentives proved stronger than threats. The Mafia then tried to pressure Matthews directly. There were attempts at negotiation. Perhaps Matthews could pay a tax on his operations. acknowledging mafia supremacy, even while maintaining his own supply chains. Matthews refused. He had not built his empire just to become a tributary of the old system. He was offering an alternative, and he wouldn't compromise that vision. Violence was discussed in mafia circles. Killing Matthews would send a message and potentially disrupt his organization. But Matthews was careful about his security. He varied his routines, maintained armed bodyguards, and made sure that his organization was structured so that his death wouldn't destroy it. Multiple lieutenants could step up and continue operations. Killing Matthews might feel satisfying, but it wouldn't actually solve the mafia's problem. Moreover, times were changing. The FBI had shifted its focus from communists to organized crime in the late 1960s. The RICO Act, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors powerful new tools to take down entire criminal organizations rather than just individual criminals. Mafia families were themselves under increasing pressure and couldn't afford to start a war with Matthews's network that would attract even more law enforcement attention. So the mafia pursued a different strategy. They used their political and law enforcement connections to make sure authorities prioritized Matthews as a target. This was something they were very good at. For decades, the mafia had cultivated relationships with police, prosecutors, and politicians. They fed information to law enforcement, carefully curated to damage their competitors while protecting their own operations. Matthews found himself facing increased scrutiny from multiple agencies. Local police in various cities began raiding his distributors. Federal agents started showing up at his properties. His international travel became more difficult as customs officials flagged him for additional screening. The pressure was building from all sides. By late 1972, Frank Matthews was at the peak of his power and the beginning of his downfall. He controlled a drug distribution network spanning 21 states. He had independent international supply lines. He had broken the mafia's monopoly and proven that black criminals could operate at the highest levels of organized crime. He had wealth beyond what most Americans could imagine. Multiple homes, luxury cars, beautiful women, respect from his peers, and fear from his enemies. But success at this level came with a target on his back. Law enforcement agencies at every level were building cases against him. The wiretaps were producing damaging evidence daily. The mafia wanted him gone. Some of his own associates, jealous of his success or looking to cut deals with prosecutors, were considering cooperation with authorities. Matthews must have sensed the walls closing in. He was too intelligent not to recognize the signs. The surveillance was becoming more obvious. Associates were being arrested and facing enormous pressure to flip. The evidence being compiled against him was overwhelming. And unlike many criminals who convinced themselves they were untouchable, Matthews understood probability. The odds of avoiding conviction were getting longer every day. He had choices to make, and they were all bad. He could fight the charges, but that would mean years in court, followed almost certainly by decades in federal prison. He could try to negotiate a plea deal, but prosecutors would demand he give up his entire organization and serve substantial time regardless. He could try to eliminate witnesses, but that would only add murder charges to his problems and guarantee he'd never see freedom again. Or he could do something that no major drug kingpin in American history had successfully done before. He could disappear. The idea must have been forming in his mind throughout 1972 and into early 1973. Matthews was a planner, someone who thought steps ahead. He had always maintained that if you couldn't see a way out of a situation, you hadn't thought hard enough. Now he was in the most difficult situation of his life, and he began planning the most audacious escape in the history of American organized crime. But first, the inevitable happened. In January 1973, federal agents moved in with indictments, and Frank Matthews's public life as a drug kingpin came to an end. His secret life, the one that would define his legend, was about to begin. January 1973 arrived cold and gray in New York City. For Frank Matthews, it arrived with a knock on the door and federal agents with badges and guns and arrest warrants. The indictments were massive, sprawling documents detailing years of drug trafficking and tax evasion. The government had been building their case methodically, compiling evidence from wiretaps, surveillance, seized financial records, and cooperating witnesses. The charges were serious enough to put Matthews away for the rest of his life. Tax evasion was included alongside the drug charges. Prosecutors had learned from the Al Capone case that sometimes you got the gangster on money crimes, when drug charges were hard to prove beyond reasonable doubt. Matthews was looking at decades in federal prison, possibly life without parole if prosecutors stacked the charges creatively. Matthews was arrested, processed, and taken into federal custody. It was a humiliating experience designed to break the spirits of powerful men. The strip searches, the fingerprinting, the mug shots, the clanging of cell doors, all of it calculated to make criminals realize their power evaporated the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. But Frank Matthews didn't break. Associates who saw him during this period noted his unusual calm. He wasn't panicking or raging or protesting his innocence. He was thinking, calculating, planning. The wheels in his mind were already turning, considering options, evaluating possibilities, gaming out scenarios. The federal detention facility held him for 4 months. 4 months of terrible food in fluorescent lights and the soul-crushing boredom of incarceration. 4 months to think about the life he'd built and the future he faced. 4 months to decide what he was willing to sacrifice and what he absolutely refused to lose. During these months, Matthews's lawyers were negotiating with prosecutors and preparing his defense. The evidence against him was substantial, but not airtight. Wiretap evidence could be challenged on constitutional grounds. Some witnesses might be discredited as criminals themselves. It wasn't hopeless, exactly, but the odds of acquittal were not good. More likely, they'd negotiate a plea to reduce charges, and Matthews would still spend 10 or 15 years in federal prison. For a man who had lived as Matthews had free, powerful, wealthy, answering to no one, the prospect of 10 or 15 years in a cage must have been unbearable. He would be in his 40s when he got out, his empire destroyed, his money seized, his reputation shattered. And that was the best-case scenario. In April 1973, Matthews posted bail. The amount was substantial, $325,000, equivalent to roughly $2 million today, but manageable for someone who had made hundreds of millions in the drug trade. What's remarkable in retrospect is that bail was granted at all. Matthews was clearly a flight risk. He had the means to disappear, the international connections to hide, and every incentive to run. But the federal judge, perhaps underestimating Matthews's resources or overestimating the justice system's ability to monitor him, approved bail with conditions. Matthews was to surrender his passport. He was to remain in the New York area. He was to check in regularly with pretrial services. Standard conditions that worked fine for normal defendants, but were woefully inadequate for someone like Frank Matthews. Matthews moved into his mansion on Staten Island, ostensibly to be with his wife and 3 children while awaiting trial. To outward appearances, he was a man resigned to his fate, cooperating with the court's requirements, preparing his defense. Federal agents conducted periodic surveillance, but not constant monitoring. They saw Matthews at his home, saw him meeting with his lawyers, saw him living a quiet, restricted life. They had no idea what was actually happening behind the scenes. Matthews was engaged in the most important logistics operation of his life. He was liquidating assets, carefully and systematically converting everything he owned into cash. Real estate was sold through intermediaries. Luxury cars were disposed of. Investments were cashed out. Everything that could be turned into portable, untraceable currency was being converted. The amounts were staggering. Matthews had been moving over $100 million annually through his operation. And while much of that was expenses and payments to distributors, he had accumulated a personal fortune estimated between $15 and $20 million. In today's money, that would be over $130 million. And Matthews wanted it in cash, in denominations that could be packed into suitcases and moved without leaving electronic traces. Converting that much money to cash without attracting attention is extraordinarily difficult. Banks are required to report large cash withdrawals. Trying to withdraw millions in cash would trigger immediate law enforcement interest. But Matthews had been preparing for something like this for years, perhaps not consciously planning an escape, but certainly maintaining financial flexibility. He had money in multiple accounts under different names. He had cash stashes hidden in various locations. He had associates he trusted who could help with the conversion process. Slowly, carefully, over the weeks following his release on bail, Matthews assembled his escape fund. He was also preparing identities. False documents were more accessible in 1973 than they would be in the age of computers and biometrics, but they still required connections and money. Matthews needed passports, driver's licenses, birth certificates, and social security numbers that would hold up under at least casual scrutiny. He needed these not just for himself, but for Cheryl Denise Brown, the woman he had chosen to accompany him into exile. Why Cheryl and not his wife? This question has been asked countless times over the past 50 years. His wife was the mother of his children, his partner in maintaining his legitimate facade. But Cheryl was younger, more adaptable, fully immersed in his real life rather than the pretense. She had no children tying her to New York, no family asking uncomfortable questions. And perhaps most importantly, Matthews was in love with her in ways he may not have been with his wife. The decision to abandon his children is perhaps the most painful aspect of Matthews's story. He had 3 kids who would grow up without their father, would learn someday that he had chosen freedom over them. The psychological impact of such abandonment is profound and lasting. But Matthews made the calculation that prison would mean losing his children anyway. And this way, at least they would be financially provided for and spared the humiliation of having their father die in federal custody. As spring turned to summer in 1973, federal authorities should have recognized the signs. Matthews was too calm, too cooperative, too seemingly accepting of his fate. Associates in his organization were being arrested, and several were cooperating with prosecutors. Yet Matthews showed no signs of the paranoia or rage that typically characterized criminals watching their empires crumble. His lawyers were going through the motions of preparing a defense, but without the usual aggressiveness that characterized attorneys representing powerful clients. It was as if everyone involved knew that the trial would never actually happen, though law enforcement didn't consciously recognize what this meant. Matthews began saying goodbyes, though carefully and subtly. He visited people, had conversations that felt slightly off, asked questions about loyalty and keeping secrets that seemed odd at the time but made sense in retrospect. He was tying up loose ends, preparing for an absence that would be permanent. Cheryl Denise Brown also began distancing herself from her normal life. She told friends she might be traveling. She settled debts. She had conversations with family members that felt like farewells, though she never explicitly said she was leaving. Like Matthews, she was preparing for the most traumatic change possible, complete disconnection from everything and everyone she had known. The federal agents monitoring Matthews should have been more suspicious. The prosecutors building the case should have asked for more stringent bail conditions or requested bail be revoked entirely. The judge should have recognized the flight risk. But everyone underestimated Frank Matthews one final time. They saw a drug dealer, a criminal who had gotten lucky, but would ultimately be ground down by the justice system like all the others. They didn't see what Matthews actually was, an extraordinarily intelligent man who had been planning for this contingency. A chess player who was always thinking moves ahead. Someone who would rather risk everything on an uncertain escape than accept the certainty of decades in prison. The last week of June 1973 was a time of frantic final preparations. Matthews had his cash, his false documents, his plans. He had picked a date, the court hearing he would never attend. He had figured out transportation, how to get from New York to wherever he was going without leaving traces that could be followed. He spent time with his children, though they didn't know these were final demise. He looked at them, memorized their faces, knowing he would never watch them grow up, never attend their graduations or weddings, never meet his grandchildren. The price of freedom was abandoning everything and everyone he loved. Did he have doubts in those final days? Did he consider just taking his chances at trial, accepting whatever sentence came, maintaining his relationship with his family? We cannot know what went through Matthews's mind, but his actions suggest a man who had made his choice and was committed to seeing it through. Cheryl Denise Brown was ready. She was 19 years old, barely an adult, preparing to spend the rest of her life as a fugitive. The adventure must have seemed exciting in some ways. All that money, a chance to start fresh somewhere exotic, to be with Matthews without secrecy or shame. But she was also giving up her family, her identity, any chance at a normal life. At 19, did she fully understand what she was choosing? Matthews made his final arrangements. Money was positioned where it could be accessed during the escape. Transportation was secured. Associates who needed to know were given final instructions, though none were told the full plan. Matthews was protecting both his escape and those he was leaving behind. If they didn't know where he was going, they couldn't tell investigators even if they wanted to. On June 26, 1973, Frank Matthews was scheduled to appear in Brooklyn Federal Court for a hearing in his case. He woke up that morning in his Staten Island mansion, perhaps looked at his wife and children one last time, and left the house as if going to court. Somewhere between his home and the courthouse, Frank Matthews and Cheryl Denise Brown vanished into history. The judge waited. The prosecutors checked their watches. Federal marshals looked for the defendant, who should have been in custody already. As minutes turned to hours, the realization set in. Frank Matthews had run. And by the time law enforcement understood what had happened, Matthews and Cheryl were already gone, swallowed by the world with $15 to $20 million, and a plan that had been years in the making. The phone call that opened this story, the one that came into the FBI's New York office on June 26, 1973, set off a flurry of activity that would continue for decades. Federal marshals were immediately sent to Matthews's last known locations. The Staten Island mansion was searched top to bottom. Federal agents interviewed his wife, who claimed to know nothing about his plans. Associates were rounded up and questioned. Banks were contacted to freeze accounts. But it was too late. Frank Matthews had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. No plane tickets were found in his name. No border crossings were recorded. No suspicious financial transactions were detected. It was as if Matthews and Cheryl Denise Brown had simply ceased to be, replaced by two other people with different names, different pasts, different futures. The escape was perfect in its execution. Matthews had learned from the failures of other fugitives. He knew that criminals who ran typically made mistakes in the first 48 hours. They used credit cards, called family members, showed up in predictable locations. Matthews made none of these errors. From the moment he disappeared, he exercised perfect operational security. The amount of cash he took, estimated between $15 and $20 million, was both enormous and insufficient. Enormous because it represented more money than most people would see in a lifetime, sufficient to live comfortably anywhere in the world for decades. Insufficient because it wasn't infinite and eventually would run out or need to be invested, potentially creating financial trails that could be traced. But in 1973, $15 million was enough to buy a lot of anonymity. In many parts of the world, you could bribe entire governments for that kind of money. You could buy protection, new identities, silence from anyone who might recognize you. Matthews had the resources to disappear, and he used them expertly. The FBI added Frank Matthews to their most wanted list. His photograph, a young black man with intelligent eyes and a confident expression, was distributed to law enforcement agencies worldwide. Rewards were offered for information leading to his capture. The media coverage was extensive. The idea of a major drug kingpin simply vanishing captivated public attention. Federal authorities were embarrassed. They had held Matthews in custody and let him go. They had been building a case against him while he was planning his escape under their noses. The escape made them look incompetent, which motivated an even more aggressive search. This wasn't just about catching a criminal anymore. It was about restoring the reputation of federal law enforcement. Interpol was notified. International alerts were sent to friendly governments. The State Department contacted embassies worldwide. Immigration officials in dozens of countries were given Matthews's description and photograph. If he tried to cross a border using his real identity, he would be caught immediately. But Matthews wasn't using his real identity. He had become someone else, and that someone else had no connection to Frank Matthews in any database or file. He was invisible in the way only a person with unlimited money and careful planning could be. Associates in Matthews's organization were subjected to intense pressure. Federal agents showed up at their homes and businesses, asking questions, making threats, offering deals. Some cooperated, providing details about Matthews's operation, his finances, his habits, and preferences. This information was compiled into profiles that might help predict where Matthews would go or what he would do. But none of them knew Matthews's actual plans. He had kept his escape strategy secret from everyone, trusting no one with information that could be used against him. His associates could tell investigators about past operations, but nothing about Matthews's current location or intentions. The information was valuable for building cases against remaining members of the organization, but useless for finding Matthews himself. His wife and children were watched constantly. Federal agents assumed Matthews might try to contact them, might miss his family enough to take risks. But no contact came. Phone lines were tapped. Mail was monitored. Visitors were noted and investigated. His wife's finances were scrutinized for any sign of secret support from Matthews. Nothing. If Matthews sent money to support his family, he did it through channels so indirect that investigators couldn't trace them. The search for Frank Matthews became one of the most extensive manhunts in American history. For months and years, federal agents pursued every lead, no matter how thin. Reported sightings came from across the country and around the world. Each required investigation, consuming resources and time. Someone thought they saw Matthews in Los Angeles. Agents descended on the location, only to find someone who looked vaguely similar. Another sighting in Miami. Another in Chicago. Another in Mexico City. Each sighting generated hope, then disappointment. Matthews was either incredibly lucky or incredibly disciplined, never making the mistakes that typically led to fugitive captures. Investigators developed theories about where Matthews might have gone. Africa was a popular hypothesis. He was black, wealthy, and might find easier acceptance in an African nation than elsewhere. Ghana was mentioned specifically in some reports. A stable, English-speaking nation with a cash-based economy, where a wealthy man could live comfortably without attracting too much attention. Nigeria was another possibility, its oil wealth creating an environment where Matthews's money wouldn't seem unusual. South America was another theory. Matthews had Venezuelan connections from his drug smuggling days. He spoke some Spanish. Countries like Brazil or Venezuela had areas where a person could disappear into expatriate communities, living comfortably without asking or answering too many questions. The favelas of Rio de Janeiro or the remote regions of Venezuela could hide someone indefinitely. The Caribbean islands presented another possibility. Islands with banking secrecy laws, with tourist economies accustomed to wealthy foreigners, with easy boat access to multiple countries. Places like the Bahamas, Jamaica, or the Dominican Republic. Matthews could have island hopped his way to anonymity, settling somewhere under an assumed identity. Some investigators theorized that Matthews never left the United States at all. With plastic surgery, new identification, and millions to spend, he could have simply become someone else right here in America. Living in a different city under a different name, maybe remarried with a new family. His past erased and replaced with a carefully constructed false history. The ultimate irony, hiding in plain sight in the country that was searching for him most intensely. The darkest theory was that Matthews hadn't escaped at all, that he was dead, murdered either by mafia enemies or by his own associates who wanted his money. Without a body, this couldn't be confirmed, but it would explain why he was never found. Dead men don't make mistakes that lead to capture. The $15 million could have been taken by whoever killed him, either spent carefully over decades or buried somewhere, lost forever. What made Frank Matthews's disappearance different from other fugitive cases? Why, 50 years later, has he never been found when virtually every other major criminal has eventually been caught or killed? The answer lies in a combination of resources, intelligence, timing, and discipline. Matthews had more money than almost any fugitive in history. $15 to $20 million was enough to buy extensive help and protection. He was extraordinarily intelligent, capable of thinking steps ahead and avoiding the impulsive decisions that doom most fugitives. The timing was crucial. Matthews escaped in 1973, before the digital age. There were no cell phones that could be tracked, no credit cards leaving electronic trails, no facial recognition systems at airports and border crossings, no internet presence that could be analyzed. The technological tools that make finding fugitives easier today simply didn't exist in 1973. Matthews disappeared at the last possible moment when truly vanishing was feasible. A decade later, computers were connecting law enforcement agencies worldwide. 2 decades later, the internet made anonymity far more difficult. 3 decades later, biometric systems and ubiquitous surveillance cameras made hiding nearly impossible. Matthews escaped during a brief historical window when a person with sufficient resources could still disappear completely. His discipline was extraordinary. Most fugitives are caught because they can't resist contacting family, returning to familiar places, or resuming habits that make them identifiable. Matthews apparently did none of these things. If he missed his children, he never tried to contact them. If he wanted to visit New York, he suppressed that desire. He completely severed himself from his old life, accepting that freedom required total commitment. Cheryl Denise Brown's complicity was also crucial. She was young enough to adapt, loyal enough not to betray him, and smart enough to maintain operational security. She also vanished completely, never resurfacing, never contacting her own family. The fact that 2 people could maintain this level of discipline for decades is remarkable. Matthews likely had help, people he paid to maintain his new identity, to facilitate his relocation, to provide ongoing security. But whoever helped him has never talked, suggesting either that Matthews chose his helpers very carefully, or that he no longer needed help after the initial escape. completely severing ties with everyone who knew who he really was. As years passed without Matthews being found, his legend grew. He became a figure of fascination in criminal culture and popular imagination. Here was someone who had beaten the system completely, who had lived by his own rules and gotten away with it. For people who felt oppressed by law enforcement or who romanticized criminal life, Matthews represented the ultimate success story. Hip-hop artists began referencing him in lyrics. He appeared alongside figures like Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas as iconic drug dealers, but with a crucial difference. While Barnes and Lucas ended up broken by the system, Matthews remained free. His story represented possibility, the idea that you could win a game that seemed rigged against you. In the 1980s, more than a decade after his disappearance, investigators were still pursuing leads. The FBI kept the case open, though it was no longer a priority. Periodic reviews of the evidence would generate new theories, but no breakthroughs. The case file grew thicker, filled with dead ends and false sightings. The 1990s brought new investigative techniques: DNA analysis, computer databases, international cooperation between law enforcement agencies, all tools that might have found Matthews. But these tools were only useful if Matthews made a mistake. If he left DNA at a crime scene, if his name appeared in some database, if he crossed paths with law enforcement somewhere. As far as anyone could tell, he made no mistakes. By the 2000s, some investigators theorized that Matthews must be dead. He would have been in his 60s by then, possibly succumbed to illness or old age. But without a body, this was just another theory. Death records were checked worldwide for anyone who might be Matthews under an assumed name, but nothing conclusive emerged. Books were written about Matthews. Ron Chepesiuk's Black Caesar, The Rise and Disappearance of Frank Matthews. Kingpin compiled extensive research about Matthews's criminal career and disappearance. Documentary filmmakers investigated his story. Each new examination of the evidence revealed the same thing. Matthews had planned brilliantly and executed perfectly. The 2010s brought a new generation of investigators who reviewed the case with fresh eyes and modern technology. Cold case units looked for patterns that earlier investigators might have missed. But even with decades of technological advancement, Matthews remained a ghost. If he was alive, he was still maintaining perfect operational security. If he was dead, his secret had died with him. Each theory about Matthews's fate has proponents and skeptics among investigators and crime historians. The Africa theory remains popular, particularly the idea that Matthews went to Ghana. Ghana in the 1970s was relatively stable, English-speaking, and with a culture that might welcome a wealthy black American. Matthews could have bribed his way into the country, established himself as a businessman, and lived openly with a false identity. Some investigators believe they received credible intelligence about Matthews being in Ghana in the late 1970s or early 1980s, though the sources were never reliable enough to act on definitively. But the persistence of these reports suggests something. If Matthews did go to Ghana, he would now be in his 80s. He could have lived an entire second life there, had children who know him only by his false identity become integrated into the community. He might have died years ago of natural causes and been buried under a name. That means nothing to anyone searching for Frank Matthews. The South America theory has similar appeal. Venezuela in particular makes sense given Matthews's existing connections there from drug smuggling. He could have arrived with Spanish-speaking ability and established criminal contacts. Venezuela's corruption and economic chaos would have made it easy for a wealthy person to buy protection and anonymity. Brazil offers similar possibilities, with the added advantage of Portuguese rather than Spanish, creating more distance from Matthews's known language skills. The Caribbean theory suggests Matthews could have settled on any of dozens of islands. The constant flow of tourists and expatriates would have provided cover. The banking secrecy laws of places like the Cayman Islands or Bahamas would have protected his money. He could have lived on a boat, moving between islands, never staying anywhere long enough to attract attention. Eventually, he might have settled somewhere, but the initial escape could have been island hopping. The hiding in America theory is the most ironic. Matthews could have had plastic surgery, changed his appearance, created a completely new identity, and settled somewhere in the United States that had no connection to his past. Maybe he became a businessman in Seattle, or a retiree in Florida, or a rancher in Montana. With enough money and careful preparation, reinventing yourself domestically was possible. Especially in pre-internet 1973, the murder theory persists because it explains why Matthews was never found. If mafia enemies caught up with him shortly after his escape, or if associates betrayed him for the money he carried, he would have died without law enforcement ever knowing. The $15 million could have been divided among his killers or buried with his body. This theory is unprovable without a body, but it can't be dismissed either. There's also the possibility that Matthews died of natural causes shortly after escaping. The stress of being a fugitive, combined with health issues that might not have been apparent before his escape, could have killed him within months or years of disappearing. If he died in some remote location, his body might never have been found. Cheryl Denise Brown might have taken the remaining money and continued hiding, or she might have died as well, their fate unknown to anyone. Is Frank Matthews still alive? The question has fascinated people for over 50 years. If he escaped in 1973 at age 29, he would be 81 years old in 2025. Old certainly, but not impossibly so. Many people live into their 80s and beyond, especially if they have access to good health care and don't have to stress about money, two things Matthews would have had. Imagine if Matthews is still alive somewhere right now, an old man, maybe with gray hair, living under a name he's used for 50 years. Maybe he married again, had children who know him only as their father, never suspecting his past. Maybe those children have given him grandchildren. Maybe he's lived a quiet, respectable life as a businessman or retiree, his criminal past known only to himself and possibly to Cheryl, if she's still with him. Does he follow news about himself? In the age of the internet, he could easily search for information about Frank Matthews without risk. He could read articles about his disappearance, about investigators still trying to find him. What must that feel like, to read about yourself as history, as an unsolved mystery, while you're sitting in a comfortable house somewhere, living under another name? Does he have regrets? Does he think about the children he abandoned? Wonder who they became? Wish he could contact them? Does he miss his old life, his power and influence, even if it came with constant danger? Or is he content with his escape, satisfied that he's lived 50 years of freedom instead of dying in prison? If Matthews is alive, he's won. He's beaten the system more completely than any criminal in American history. He's lived longer as a free man than he lived as Frank Matthews. His new identity is more real now than his birth identity ever was. He is, in every practical sense, someone else entirely. But has he really won? He's lived 50 years unable to be himself, unable to acknowledge his accomplishments, unable to contact his family, unable to go home. He's a man living in permanent exile from his own life. Is that freedom, or just a different kind of prison? The FBI kept the Frank Matthews case open for decades, a testament to both the seriousness of his crimes and the frustration of his escape. Case agents retired and were replaced by new agents who reviewed the files, pursued new leads, and always came up empty. The case file grew to thousands of pages, documenting every theory, every sighting, every avenue of investigation, pursued and exhausted. In the 1980s, the war on drugs ramped up dramatically under the Reagan administration. Massive resources were poured into law enforcement. New task forces were created and international cooperation increased. But none of this helped find Matthews. He had vanished in an earlier era and left no traces that newer technologies could follow. The FBI interviewed hundreds of people who had known Matthews. Family members, former associates, people who had done business with him. Some cooperated fully, hoping for leniency in their own cases. Others refused to say anything, maintaining loyalty to Matthews even decades after his disappearance. But none of them knew where he had gone. Matthews had kept his escape plans completely secret, trusting no one with information that could betray him. Investigators used psychological profiling, trying to predict Matthews's behavior based on his past patterns. Where would a man with his characteristics feel comfortable? What kind of environment would appeal to him? How would he spend his money? These profiles suggested various locations, but profiles are only useful if the subject behaves predictably. Matthews had proven himself unpredictable in the most important way, by disappearing completely when conventional wisdom suggested he couldn't. Financial investigations tried to trace the $15 to $20 million. If Matthews was living somewhere, he had to be spending money. But tracking cash in the 1970s and 1980s was nearly impossible. Unlike electronic transfers that leave clear trails, cash could be spent anywhere without documentation. Matthews could have lived for decades on cash alone, carefully managing his resources, never creating financial patterns that could be detected. International cooperation gradually improved. The FBI developed better relationships with police forces in Africa, South America, and the Caribbean. If Matthews was hiding in one of these regions, local law enforcement might stumble across him, or an informant might come forward. But the decades passed, and no credible information emerged. Frank Matthews's disappearance entered American mythology alongside stories like D.B. Cooper's skyjacking and Jimmy Hoffa's vanishing. He became a symbol of the perfect escape, proof that with enough planning and resources, it was possible to beat the system completely. In hip-hop culture, Matthews became an iconic figure. Rappers name-checked him alongside other legendary drug dealers. But with a crucial distinction. While Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes were cautionary tales of criminals who fell, Matthews was an aspirational figure, the one who got away. Songs referenced Black Caesar, comparing current dealers to Matthews, and usually finding them wanting. To be compared to Frank Matthews was the highest compliment in a world that valued both success and the intelligence to preserve it. The nickname Black Caesar itself became part of his legend. It invoked both racial pride and imperial power, suggesting Matthews was royalty in the criminal world. The name appeared in songs, in street conversations, in the mythology of the drug trade. Young dealers growing up in the 1980s and 1990s heard stories about Matthews, often exaggerated or distorted through retelling, but always emphasizing the same themes: intelligence, organization, and the ultimate escape. Films and documentaries explored his story. In 2012, a documentary titled The Frank Matthews Story attempted to piece together his life and disappearance. The filmmakers interviewed former associates, law enforcement officials, and historians, compiling the most comprehensive visual record of Matthews's story. But even they couldn't answer the fundamental question: what happened to him? Books delved into Matthews's life with varying degrees of accuracy. Ron Chepetiuk's Black Caesar remains the definitive account, meticulously researched and soberly told. Other books sensationalized aspects of his story or mixed speculation with fact in ways that obscured the truth. But all of them acknowledged Matthews as a unique figure in American crime, the one who truly got away. True crime enthusiasts debated his fate endlessly. Online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries featured long threads about Matthews, with amateur detectives proposing theories and examining evidence. Some claimed to have insider knowledge about his whereabouts. Others analyzed old photographs, looking for Matthews in the background of pictures taken in various countries over the decades. None of these amateur investigations produced credible results, but they demonstrated the enduring fascination with his story. Matthews's legend also served a broader cultural purpose. For Black Americans who saw the criminal justice system as fundamentally racist and unjust, Matthews represented successful resistance. He had refused to accept the limitations placed on him by segregated society. He had challenged white-controlled organized crime and won. And when the system came for him, he escaped rather than submit. Whether one approved of drug dealing or not, there was something compelling about a black man in 1970s America, taking control of his own destiny so completely. To fully appreciate Frank Matthews's uniqueness, consider what happened to his peers and successors in the drug trade. Every major drug kingpin in American history has either been killed, captured, or broken by the system. Everyone except Matthews. Pablo Escobar, the Colombian cocaine king who became the wealthiest criminal in history, was killed by Colombian National Police in 1993, despite his billions, his army of sicarios, and his political influence. Escobar died on a rooftop in Medellin, shot down while trying to escape. His empire collapsed, his family fled, and his legacy became a cautionary tale about the inevitable fall of drug lords. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, perhaps the most famous Mexican cartel leader, was captured, escaped, was captured again, escaped again, and was finally captured a third time. He's now serving life in a supermax prison in Colorado, spending 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. For all his wealth and power, El Chapo ended up exactly where the system wanted him, in a cage, his freedom permanently revoked. Frank Lucas, whose life inspired the film American Gangster, served time in prison, became a cooperating witness against corrupt police officers, and eventually died in 2019 at age 88. But Lucas died as a man whose empire had been destroyed decades earlier, who had betrayed his associates to reduce his sentence, and who spent his final years giving interviews about his past glory while living in poverty. Nicky Barnes, once so powerful he appeared on the cover of the New York Times magazine under the headline, Mr. Untouchable, also became a government witness. He testified against his former associates, entered witness protection, and died in 2012. His death wasn't even announced until 2019, reflecting how completely he had been erased from his former life. Barnes lived his final decades under an assumed name, cut off from family, his legendary status reduced to a footnote in law enforcement history. Griselda Blanco, the cocaine godmother, who pioneered cocaine trafficking from Colombia to the United States, was eventually arrested, served prison time, was deported to Colombia, and was murdered in Medellin in 2012. Her story, like so many others, ended in violence and loss. Freeway Rick Ross, the Los Angeles dealer who helped fuel the crack epidemic of the 1980s, was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. His sentence was eventually reduced, and he was released in 2009, but only after spending decades behind bars. He emerged from prison as a middle-aged man whose empire had been destroyed, his youth and freedom sacrificed to the drug trade. Frank Matthews stands alone among this company. He was never killed. He was never captured. He never became an informant. He never served serious time. He simply vanished and stayed vanished, maintaining his freedom while all his peers eventually fell. This distinction is what makes him legendary. Intelligence was Matthews's primary advantage. Many drug dealers are smart in practical ways. They understand street dynamics, can spot opportunities, know how to avoid obvious law enforcement traps. But Matthews was intelligent in a deeper sense. He thought strategically, not just tactically. He planned for contingencies. He understood systems and how to exploit their weaknesses. His business smarts set him apart. Matthews didn't think like a gangster. He thought like a CEO. He understood supply chains, market dynamics, organizational structure, and financial management. He built an empire not through violence, primarily, though he used violence when necessary, but through superior business practices. He offered better products at better prices and organized more efficiently than his competitors. Matthews was also emotionally controlled in ways many criminals are not. Drug dealing attracts people who are often impulsive, ego-driven, prone to violence over petty slights. Matthews could separate business from emotion. He didn't kill people because they disrespected him. He dealt with threats pragmatically, using violence only when it served a clear business purpose. This restraint kept him from attracting unnecessary law enforcement attention and from making enemies needlessly. His vision extended beyond immediate profits. While other dealers focused on maximizing current income, Matthews was building infrastructure for long-term success. He invested in connections, in diversified supply chains, in organizational backup that could survive disruptions. He was playing a longer game than his peers, which is why his empire grew larger and more resilient. Perhaps most importantly, Matthews knew when to quit. Many criminals can't give up the game, even when the smart move is to walk away. They're addicted to the power, the money, the lifestyle. They convince themselves they can beat the odds, even as the evidence mounts that they can't. Matthews assessed his situation in 1973 and made the hardest decision. He chose freedom over everything else. This ability to cut losses and pivot completely is rare in any field, but especially in criminal enterprise, where ego and reputation often outweigh rationality. His timing, as mentioned before, was crucial. Matthews escaped at the perfect historical moment, late enough that he had made enormous wealth, but early enough that technology hadn't made disappearing impossible. A few years earlier, he wouldn't have had enough money. A few years later, computer systems and international law enforcement cooperation would have made escape far more difficult. Matthews's escape window was narrow, and he recognized it and exploited it perfectly. Over 50 years after Frank Matthews vanished, the mystery endures. New generations discover his story and become fascinated by the same questions that have intrigued people for decades. Where did he go? Is he still alive? How did he maintain operational security for so long? Will we ever know the truth? The passage of time makes the mystery both more and less compelling. More compelling because each passing decade proves how completely Matthews disappeared. Less compelling because if Matthews is still alive, he's an old man now, and his eventual death will likely occur without anyone knowing. The secret will die with him. For law enforcement, Matthews represents a failure, but also a challenge that shaped how they approach fugitive cases. The lessons learned from failing to find Matthews influenced policies about bail, monitoring high-risk defendants, and international cooperation in fugitive cases. In this sense, Matthews's escape improved the system he beat. For the black community, especially for those who came of age in the era of mass incarceration and aggressive policing, Matthews represents something complex. He was a drug dealer who contributed to the destruction of communities through addiction. But he was also a black man who refused to accept his place in a racist society, who built an empire in a world dominated by white organized crime, and who escaped when the system came for him. These contradictions make him a difficult figure to assess morally, but an undeniably fascinating one historically. The mystery also raises philosophical questions about success and freedom. If Matthews is alive somewhere, living under an assumed name, has he succeeded? He has freedom. He's not in prison, not dead. But he also has no identity, no acknowledgement of his accomplishments, no connection to his past or his family. Is freedom without identity truly freedom? Or is it its own form of imprisonment? One reason Matthews's story fascinates is that it could never happen today. The world of 1973 was fundamentally different from the world of 2025 in ways that made Matthews's escape possible then, but would make it impossible now. In 1973, international borders were more porous. Passport control existed, but without the sophisticated biometric systems and international databases that exist today. A high-quality fake passport might fool a border guard doing a visual inspection. Today, passports are scanned, fingerprints are checked against international databases, and facial recognition systems flag potential matches. In 1973, financial transactions were largely cash-based and untracked. Matthews could carry $15 million in physical currency and spend it over decades without creating electronic trails. Today, large cash transactions are flagged automatically. Moving money across borders triggers reports, even in cash-based economies. Surveillance and documentation have increased dramatically. In 1973, communication meant phones and letters, both relatively easy to keep secret if you were careful. Today, digital communication leaves traces everywhere. Cell phones are tracking devices. Email servers maintain logs. Social media creates vast networks of connections. Even encrypted communications can be compromised. Matthews lived in the last era when truly disappearing from communication networks was possible. In 1973, visual surveillance was limited. Security cameras were rare, and video footage was poor quality. Today, cameras are everywhere. On street corners, in businesses, at ATMs, on phones carried by every person you pass. Facial recognition software can scan thousands of faces per minute. Even if you never use your real identity, your face might be matched against old photographs in law enforcement databases. In 1973, you could reinvent yourself relatively easily. Birth certificates and identification documents were easier to forge or obtain fraudulently. Background checks were superficial. Today, every aspect of identity is cross-referenced and verified electronically. Creating a false identity that can withstand scrutiny requires defeating multiple interconnected systems. Matthews escaped during a brief window in human history when wealth and planning could overcome surveillance and tracking systems. That window has closed. Today, a fugitive with Matthews's profile would be found within months, possibly weeks. The technological cage that now surrounds all of us would be inescapable. This makes Matthews's story even more remarkable in retrospect. He didn't just beat the system of his time. He beat the last version of the system that could actually be beaten. He was the right criminal at the right moment, and he recognized and seized the opportunity. Frank Matthews fundamentally changed American drug trafficking in ways that persist to this day. Before Matthews, the model was clear. Italian Mafia families controlled importation and wholesale distribution, while black and Hispanic dealers handled street-level sales. This racial hierarchy was considered unchangeable, enforced by violence and connections that seemed unbreakable. Matthews shattered this model. He proved that black dealers could establish their own international connections, could operate sophisticated interstate networks, could compete with and even surpass the traditional organized crime families. After Matthews, the drug trade was never the same. Other black dealers followed his example, establishing their own supply chains, building their own organizations, refusing to accept subordinate roles in the criminal economy. The crack epidemic of the 1980s, while devastating for black communities, demonstrated how completely the drug trade had been transformed. Black dealers weren't buying from Italian suppliers anymore. They were connected directly to Colombian cartels, to Mexican smugglers, to international sources. The decentralized network model that Matthews pioneered became standard across the industry. This transformation wasn't necessarily positive. The democratization of drug trafficking meant more violence as competing organizations fought for territory without the mafia's traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. It meant younger, less disciplined criminals entering the trade without the organizational restraints that had somewhat contained violence in earlier eras. But it did prove that criminal enterprise, like legitimate business, could transcend racial barriers when economic incentives were strong enough. Matthews also demonstrated the vulnerability of monopolies, even those enforced by violence. The Italian Mafia's control of heroin importation seemed unbreakable until Matthews broke it. His success showed that entrenched power structures could be challenged by innovative competitors willing to take risks. This lesson applied beyond drug trafficking to organized crime more broadly. The geographic scope of Matthews's operation was unprecedented for a black criminal in that era. Moving drugs through 21 states required sophisticated logistics, reliable transportation networks, and trusted distributors in each location. Matthews built this empire by combining his own organizational genius with careful selection of partners. Each state operation was semi-autonomous, insulated from the others so that law enforcement actions in one location wouldn't bring down the entire network. This cellular structure was ahead of its time, predating the terrorist networks that would adopt similar organizational models decades later. If one cell was compromised, the others continued operating, and Matthews could rebuild the damaged section. The empire stretched from the East Coast to the West Coast, from major cities to smaller markets. Matthews understood that saturation in a single location attracted too much law enforcement attention and created unnecessary competition. Spreading operations geographically distributed risk and maximized overall revenue, even if individual markets were smaller. Coordinating this empire required management skills that many legitimate business people would struggle to match. Matthews had to maintain communication with distributors across the country, coordinate shipments from international sources to multiple domestic locations, manage finances across state lines, and resolve disputes between territorial operators. All of this while maintaining secrecy and avoiding law enforcement detection. The infrastructure Matthews built outlasted his own involvement. When he disappeared in 1973, parts of his network continued operating, taken over by former lieutenants who maintained some of his organizational principles. The distribution channels he established were used by subsequent generations of dealers. In this sense, Matthews's empire didn't disappear with him. It evolved and fragmented, but elements persisted for decades. Those who knew Frank Matthews described him as charismatic and intelligent, projecting confidence without arrogance. He was a talker, able to convince people to work with him, to trust him with large sums of money or valuable products. This charisma was crucial to his success. Drug dealing requires constant negotiation and relationship management, and Matthews excelled at both. He was also described as controlled and calculating. Unlike dealers who let emotions drive decisions, Matthews thought through situations carefully. He assessed risks and rewards, considered multiple options before acting, and rarely made impulsive choices. This temperament served him well in a business where impulsive violence often attracted fatal law enforcement attention. Matthews maintained loyalty from his organization through a combination of fair dealing and demonstrated power. He paid his people well and on time. He didn't cheat distributors or arbitrarily change terms. This reliability made people want to work with him. But he also made clear that betrayal would be punished severely. The few examples of people who crossed Matthews served as cautionary tales that kept the rest in line. His personal style, the expensive cars, the fashionable clothes, the visible wealth might seem like poor operational security, but it served a purpose. Matthews was making a statement about black success and power in an era when such statements were rare and dangerous. His lifestyle was aspirational for people in his community, making him a figure worthy of respect and emulation. This reputation enhanced his position and made recruiting easier. Yet Matthews also demonstrated restraint when it mattered most. He didn't give interviews to newspapers. He didn't brag publicly about his criminal exploits. He maintained enough discretion to avoid becoming a media sensation like Nicky Barnes, whose New York Times Magazine cover ultimately contributed to his downfall. Matthews understood the difference between reputation within his world and notoriety in the broader public. He cultivated the former while avoiding the latter, until circumstances made it unavoidable. His relationship with family was complicated. He maintained a wife and children, providing them with a comfortable life while keeping them insulated from his criminal activities. His decision to abandon them when he fled remains one of the most painful aspects of his story. Whatever else Matthews was, he was a father who chose his own freedom over his children's well-being. This choice haunts his legacy, reminding us that even successful criminals impose terrible costs on those closest to them. Is Frank Matthews still alive? In 2025, he would be 81 years old. Life expectancy for men in many countries reaches into the 80s, so it's certainly possible he's alive. If he maintained the wealth he escaped with, he would have access to good health care and comfortable living conditions, factors that promote longevity. But 81 is old. Many people don't reach that age. And Matthews lived a stressful life before his escape. Years of drug dealing, constant risk of violence or arrest, the psychological toll of maintaining multiple identities and relationships. This stress might have shortened his life, even if he escaped the immediate threats of his criminal career. If Matthews died years ago, perhaps in the 1980s or 1990s, the secret died with him. Cheryl Denise Brown, if she survived him and is still alive, has maintained her silence for over 50 years. At this point, she's lived longer as whoever she became than as Cheryl Denise Brown. Would she reveal the truth even if Matthews is gone? Probably not. Her freedom depends on maintaining the fiction of her new identity. It's possible Matthews died shortly after escaping. The stress of being a fugitive, combined with potential health issues, could have killed him within months or a few years of his disappearance. If he died in a remote location, or if his body was disposed of by people protecting his legacy, we might never know. This scenario would explain why he was never found. Dead men don't make the mistakes that get fugitives caught. If Matthews is alive, he's watching his legend grow from a distance. He can read about himself online, see documentaries about his life, observe how his story has been mythologized. This must create a strange disconnect, watching yourself become history while you're still living. Does he want to correct the record, to tell his side of the story? Or is he content to let the mystery persist, knowing that his silence is what keeps him free? The odds suggest Matthews is probably dead by now, whether from natural causes or other circumstances. But the absence of confirmed death means we can't know for certain. And that uncertainty is precisely what makes his story so compelling. As long as we don't know, the possibility exists that somewhere in the world, an 81-year-old man is living quietly, carrying a secret that would shock anyone who knew him in his current life. From the vantage point of 2025, Frank Matthews' story takes on additional layers of meaning. The war on drugs that escalated after his escape has proven to be a failure by most measures. Mass incarceration has devastated black communities without significantly reducing drug availability. The racial disparities in drug enforcement that existed in Matthews' era have, if anything, become more pronounced. This context makes Matthews' escape somewhat more sympathetic to modern audiences. He was a drug dealer, certainly, contributing to addiction and community destruction. But he was also a black man navigating a racist criminal justice system that imprisoned black people at vastly higher rates than white people for comparable crimes. His refusal to submit to that system, his choice to flee rather than spend decades in prison, can be understood as resistance to an unjust structure. The romantic mythology around Matthews should be tempered with acknowledgement of the harm drug trafficking causes. Heroin addiction destroys lives, tears apart families, and devastates communities. Matthews profited enormously from this destruction. Whatever else he accomplished, this fundamental fact remains. He was not a freedom fighter or a civil rights hero. He was a criminal who sold poison for profit. Yet Matthews's intelligence and organizational ability are undeniable. Had he been born in different circumstances, with legitimate opportunities available, what might he have become? A corporate executive? A successful entrepreneur? A political leader? His story raises uncomfortable questions about how society allocates opportunity and what happens when intelligent, ambitious people are denied legitimate paths to success. The technological impossibility of repeating Matthews's escape today adds poignancy to his story. He represents a type of freedom that no longer exists, the freedom to completely disappear, to reinvent yourself entirely, to escape your past and become someone new. In our interconnected, surveilled modern world, this freedom has been largely eliminated. Matthews caught the last train out before the station closed permanently. Where did Frank Matthews go after June 26, 1973? This remains the central mystery. Every theory has proponents, but none have been proven. Africa, South America, the Caribbean, hiding in America itself, all are possible. None are certain. How long did he live? If he died shortly after escaping, his story is tragic in its own way. Freedom achieved, but barely enjoyed. If he lived for decades, building a new life, and perhaps finding happiness, his story becomes one of successful transformation. We simply don't know. Did Cheryl Denise Brown stay with him? She disappeared as completely as Matthews, which suggests either complete loyalty or that something happened to her. If she's still alive, she's now in her early 70s. Has she maintained the relationship with Matthews for over 50 years? Or did they separate shortly after escaping, each going their own way with a share of the money? Did Matthews ever regret his decision? Did he miss his children? Wish he could attend their weddings or meet his grandchildren? Did he follow their lives from a distance somehow? Or did he completely sever emotional ties, accepting that escape required total disconnection? The psychological cost of his choice must have been enormous, but we have no way to measure it. Did he ever come close to being caught? Were there moments when someone recognized him, when he nearly made a mistake that would have exposed him? Or has his operational security been perfect for 50 years? Never a close call, never a moment of real danger. Both scenarios seem almost impossible, yet one must be true. What name does he use? What identity did he assume? Does he have a family that knows him only as this other person? Has he been a good father to children who don't know his real past? Has he lived as a law-abiding citizen for 50 years? Or has he continued criminal activities under his new identity? Will we ever know the truth? Probably not. If Matthews is alive, revealing himself means imprisonment. If he's dead, the secret likely died with him. Unless Cheryl Denise Brown decides to tell her story, which seems increasingly unlikely as years pass, the mystery will probably remain unsolved forever. Frank Matthews built an empire, made hundreds of millions of dollars, became one of the most powerful criminals in America, and challenged structures of organized crime that had seemed unchangeable. But to preserve his freedom, he had to abandon everything: his name, his family, his reputation, his identity itself. Is this success or failure? He's not in prison, which by criminal standards is success. But he's also not Frank Matthews anymore, which means the success belongs to someone else, to the person he became. The man who built the empire doesn't get to enjoy the recognition or legacy. The person who lives free isn't the person who earned it. This paradox is what makes Matthews' story ultimately tragic, despite its superficial success. He won by disappearing, which means his victory can never be celebrated. He beat the system by ceasing to exist within it. His greatest achievement, maintaining freedom, requires that he never acknowledge any of his other achievements. Compare this to criminals who went to prison but maintained their identities. They lost their freedom but kept their names, their stories, their place in history. Frank Lucas could give interviews about his past, write books, be portrayed in movies. Nicky Barnes could know that people remembered him, that his name meant something. Matthews has none of this. If he's alive, he's a nobody, a person with no interesting past, no story worth telling. Is freedom without identity truly freedom? Philosophers might debate this question, but Matthews has had to live it. If he's alive somewhere, he knows the answer in ways the rest of us can only imagine. Every day for 50 years, he's made the choice that freedom, under any terms, is preferable to imprisonment. Or perhaps he's regretted his choice daily, wishing he could reclaim his identity, even at the cost of his freedom. We cannot know. What we do know is that Frank Matthews, Black Caesar, the man who built a drug empire and defied the mafia and disappeared completely, achieved something unique in American criminal history. He became a ghost, a legend, an unsolved mystery that has fascinated people for over half a century. And in becoming a ghost, he achieved a strange kind of immortality. The man himself may be dead, but the mystery lives on. Frank Matthews remains one of the greatest mysteries in American crime history. He built an empire that stretched across 21 states and challenged the Italian Mafia's control of drug trafficking. He organized unprecedented summit meetings that united black dealers in opposition to established power structures. He made hundreds of millions of dollars and lived like royalty, with mansions and luxury cars and beautiful women. And then, on June 26, 1973, he vanished into history with his teenage girlfriend and $15 to $20 million in cash. 52 years later, as of 2025, there are still no answers. No body has ever been found. No confirmed sightings have ever been authenticated. No deathbed confessions have emerged. Frank Matthews simply ceased to exist as Frank Matthews, and whoever he became has kept that secret perfectly. He is, by any measure, the ultimate gangster story, the one who actually beat the system. While Pablo Escobar was shot down on a rooftop, while El Chapo was locked in a supermax prison, while Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes became informants who died in obscurity, Frank Matthews escaped and stayed escaped. He won the game that every other kingpin lost. But did he really win? Whether living or dead, free or trapped in permanent hiding, Matthews paid an enormous price for his freedom. He abandoned his 3 children, left them to grow up without a father, to wonder their entire lives why he chose to disappear rather than stay and fight. He severed all connections to his past, giving up his identity, his accomplishments, his legacy, everything that made him Frank Matthews. If he's alive somewhere right now, an 81-year-old man living under an assumed name, he's spent more years as someone else than he spent as himself. The person he became has existed longer than Frank Matthews ever did. That false identity is more real now than the birth identity ever was. He's living proof that you can escape anything except yourself. And perhaps he's even escaped that. The fascination with Matthews' story transcends simple true crime interest. His escape represents something deeper, the possibility of radical transformation, of complete reinvention, of defeating systems that seem designed to trap us. In an age of total surveillance and digital tracking, Matthews' disappearance represents a kind of freedom that no longer exists. He escaped during the last historical moment when such escape was possible, and that makes his story both inspiring and sad. We're fascinated because we crave mystery in an age that explains everything. We're fascinated because Matthews represents intelligence triumphing over institutional power. We're fascinated because somewhere in the back of our minds, we wonder, could we disappear if we had to? Do we have the discipline, the intelligence, the courage to give up everything and become someone else? Matthews answered that question definitively. Yes. Where did he go? Africa seems most likely. Ghana specifically, where English is spoken and where a wealthy black American might integrate relatively easily. But South America is possible, or the Caribbean, or even staying in America under an assumed identity. Each theory has logic behind it, but none have been proven. How long did he live? If he's dead, did he survive a few months, a few years, or decades as a fugitive? Did he live long enough to enjoy his freedom, or did stress and circumstance kill him shortly after his escape? We may never know. Did Cheryl stay with him? She disappeared as completely as Matthews, suggesting either perfect loyalty or that something terrible happened to her. If she's alive, she's in her early 70s now, having lived 50 years under a false identity. Has she maintained her silence out of love, fear, or habit? Will she ever tell her story? Did Matthews have regrets? Did he think about his children on their birthdays, wonder who they became, wish he could contact them? Or did he completely compartmentalize his past, treating Frank Matthews as a person who no longer existed? The psychological cost of his choice must have been staggering. Did he watch his legend grow? With the internet, he could easily search for information about himself without risk. He could read articles, watch documentaries, see how his story has been mythologized. What must that feel like, to be history while still living? And the ultimate question, is he still out there? 81 years old, maybe with gray hair and age spots, living in some comfortable house somewhere, carrying a secret that would shock anyone who knew him. An old man who was once America's biggest drug kingpin, who outsmarted the FBI, who disappeared completely and stayed disappeared for over half a century. Or is he dead, perhaps buried under a name that means nothing to anyone, his secret taken to the grave? Did he die years ago, decades ago, or quite recently? If so, did Cheryl attend his funeral under their assumed names, mourning a person no one else knew existed? The human mind craves resolution. We want stories to have endings. Unsolved mysteries frustrate us because they violate our need for closure. Frank Matthews' story is the ultimate unsolved mystery, not just where he went, but whether he succeeded in any meaningful sense, whether freedom without identity is truly freedom at all. We also can't stop wondering because Matthews challenges our assumptions about how the world works. We believe that crime doesn't pay, that criminals eventually get caught, that the system works. Matthews proves that under the right circumstances, with enough intelligence and resources and perfect timing, you can beat the system completely. This possibility both thrills and disturbs us. For Black Americans especially, Matthews represents something complex and contradictory. He was a drug dealer who contributed to the destruction of Black communities through addiction and violence. But he was also a Black man who refused to accept the limitations of a racist society, who built an empire in a world dominated by white organized crime, who challenged power structures and won. These contradictions make him difficult to assess morally, but impossible to dismiss. Matthews' story also represents the last gasp of a certain kind of freedom, the freedom to completely disappear, to reinvent yourself entirely, to escape your past and become someone new. That freedom has been largely eliminated by technology, by surveillance, by the interconnected digital systems that track our every move. Matthews represents what was possible in a previous era, a possibility that no longer exists. And perhaps most fundamentally, we can't stop wondering because mysteries are how we explore deeper questions. Matthews' story isn't really about drug dealing or law enforcement. It's about identity, freedom, family, choice, and the price we pay for the lives we choose to live. His disappearance forces us to ask, what would we give up for freedom? What would we sacrifice? How much of ourselves would we be willing to lose to avoid losing our liberty? Frank Matthews changed American organized crime forever. Before him, the racial hierarchy was clear and seemingly unchangeable. After him, black dealers knew they could compete at the highest levels, could establish international connections, could build empires that rivaled anything the Mafia created. This transformation wasn't positive. It contributed to the violence and chaos of the crack epidemic and the drug wars that followed. But it was real and lasting. He proved that intelligence and organization matter more than tradition and violence. The Mafia's century-old dominance couldn't withstand a smart competitor willing to innovate. Matthews's business model direct international connections, decentralized organization, superior products at competitive prices became the template for drug trafficking organizations for decades to come. His disappearance proved that with sufficient resources and planning, escape is possible. Every fugitive since Matthews has been measured against his standard. Most fail within months or years, caught because they can't maintain the discipline Matthews demonstrated. But the fact that Matthews succeeded provides hope and inspiration for others considering the same gamble. For better or worse, Frank Matthews became an icon. In hip-hop culture, in street mythology, in the folklore of organized crime, his name resonates. To be compared to Matthews is the highest compliment in certain circles. He represents intelligence triumphing over power, planning defeating systems, the ultimate underdog victory. But his legacy is also cautionary. He abandoned his children, contributed to untold suffering through drug trafficking, and lived a life that required constant deception and vigilance. If he's alive, he spent 50 years unable to be himself. If he's dead, his children never got closure, never learned what happened to their father. The cost of his success was enormous for everyone involved. So was Frank Matthews successful? By the narrowest definition, avoiding prison and maintaining freedom, yes, he succeeded brilliantly. He's the only major drug kingpin in American history to truly escape. 52 years is longer than most prison sentences. If he's alive and free, he won decisively. But by almost any other definition, his life is tragic. He gave up his children, his identity, his accomplishments, his very self. He can't celebrate his victories or acknowledge his intelligence and organizational genius. If anyone asks about his past, he must lie or deflect. He's trapped in a different way than prison, confined by the need for constant secrecy. The question, would you rather spend 30 years in prison as yourself or 50 years free as someone else, has no easy answer. Some would choose imprisonment to maintain their identity and relationships. Others would choose freedom at any cost. Matthews chose freedom, and he's lived with that choice longer than most of us will live entirely. Perhaps the real tragedy is that Matthews had to make that choice at all. Born into different circumstances, with legitimate opportunities available, his intelligence and ambition might have made him a successful businessman, a political leader, a figure celebrated rather than hunted. Instead, growing up poor and black in the segregated South, facing limited options and systemic racism, he turned his talents to crime and ultimately to escape. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American society. How many Frank Matthews are there brilliant people whose talents are wasted or turned to destructive purposes because legitimate paths to success are blocked by poverty, racism, and systemic inequality? What does it say about our society that one of the most successful escapes in criminal history was accomplished by a black man fleeing a justice system that has historically been anything but just to black Americans? These questions don't excuse drug dealing or minimize the harm Matthews caused, but they provide context for understanding why his story resonates so powerfully, particularly in communities that have experienced both the drug epidemic and mass incarceration. Matthews represents both the problem and a form of resistance to it, however problematic that resistance may be. And so the mystery endures. Frank Matthews, Black Caesar, the man who built a 21-state drug empire and vanished with millions of dollars, remains unfound and probably unfindable. Each year that passes makes the mystery deeper. Each birthday he may or may not be celebrating, each quiet day he may or may not be living somewhere in the world under another name, adds another layer to the legend. Somewhere, perhaps, an old man sits on a porch or in a comfortable living room. His hair is gray now, if he has hair at all. His face is lined with age. His body shows the wear of 8 decades of life. If you met him, you'd see an ordinary elderly person, maybe with a kind smile and interesting stories about a life you'd have no reason to doubt. But if you looked closer, if you could see past the decades and the assumed identity, if you knew what to look for, you might notice intelligence in his eyes that seems unusual. You might notice that he's careful about what he says, that he deflects certain questions, that parts of his past remain mysteriously vague. You might notice that he seems to have resources beyond what his supposed career would explain, or that he's well-traveled in ways that don't quite make sense. Or maybe you'd notice nothing at all. Maybe his cover is perfect after 50 years. Maybe he's so completely become his new identity that no trace of Frank Matthews remains visible. Maybe he's told the story of his false life so many times that it's more real to him now than the truth. Maybe he's convinced even himself that Frank Matthews was someone else entirely, a person who died in 1973 when he walked away from his court date and became someone new. Or maybe he's not sitting anywhere at all. Maybe Frank Matthews died decades ago, his body buried under a name that meant nothing, his secret dying with him. Maybe Cheryl Denise Brown is the only living person who knows the truth and shall take it to her grave. Maybe the mystery will never be solved because there's nothing left to solve, just a cold trail that ended half a century ago with a death that no one recorded because no one knew who had died. We will probably never know. And perhaps that's fitting. Frank Matthews' greatest achievement was disappearing so completely that even 52 years later, with all our technology and databases and investigative techniques, we still can't find him. His escape was perfect, and perfection doesn't leave traces. The legend will outlive us all. Long after everyone who knew Frank Matthews is dead, long after the last person who could possibly remember him is gone, his story will remain. Future generations will discover it, be fascinated by it, debate the same questions we've debated. Where did he go? Is he still alive? Did he succeed or fail? What does his story mean? And they won't find answers either, because the answer died with Frank Matthews, either decades ago or quite recently, or perhaps sometime in between. The mystery is eternal, because the mystery is the point. Frank Matthews didn't just escape from law enforcement. He escaped from history itself, from the narrative that insists all criminals eventually fall. He proved that with enough intelligence, resources, planning, and perfect execution, you could write your own ending. Whether that ending was happy or sad, triumphant or tragic, we cannot know. But it was his ending, chosen and executed with the same intelligence that built his empire. And in a world where most people feel powerless, where systems seem designed to trap us and dictate our fates, there's something compelling about a man who looked at the system, saw no acceptable options, and simply walked away. Frank Matthews, Black Caesar, the man who got away. The mystery remains. The legend endures. And somewhere, maybe, an old man smiles at his own myth, while the world still searches for someone who vanished into thin air 52 years ago. As of 2025, the FBI has never officially closed the Frank Matthews case, though it's no longer an active investigation in the way it was in the 1970s and 1980s. The case file remains available for review. a testament to both Matthews's significance and the frustration of his escape. Periodically, new information surfaces that generates brief excitement. Someone claims to have seen Matthews in a particular location. A document is discovered that might shed light on his escape route. A deathbed confession mentions his name. Each time, investigators evaluate the information, and each time it leads nowhere. The sightings are mistaken identity. The documents are inconclusive. The confessions are unreliable. Technology continues to advance in ways that theoretically should make finding Matthews easier. Facial recognition software can scan millions of images. DNA databases can identify people from genetic relatives. International cooperation between law enforcement agencies has never been better. But none of these tools help if Matthews died decades ago, or if he's lived so carefully under his assumed identity that he's never intersected with any system that would flag him. Genealogical research techniques that have solved decades-old cold cases might eventually provide answers about Matthews. If he had children under his assumed identity, their DNA would eventually connect back to his biological children from his marriage. Such connections have solved murder cases and identified unknown remains. But this assumes Matthews had more children, that those children participated in DNA databases, and that investigators knew to look for such connections. It's a long shot at best. The passage of time is the investigation's greatest enemy. Anyone who might have helped Matthews escape is likely dead now. The people who knew him in his original life are aging rapidly. His biological children are now in their 50s or older. Each year that passes, the chances of solving the mystery diminish. Soon, everyone with direct knowledge will be gone, and the case will belong entirely to historians rather than investigators. Some law enforcement officials have suggested that Matthews should be declared legally dead. It's been over 50 years since his disappearance. Under normal circumstances, 7 years without contact is sufficient for a legal declaration of death. But declaring Matthews dead would mean officially closing the case, admitting defeat, acknowledging that he succeeded in his escape. For institutional reasons, law enforcement seems reluctant to do this. Frank Matthews's 3 children have lived their entire adult lives with the absence of their father. They were young when he disappeared, old enough to remember him, too young to understand what had happened. Imagine growing up knowing your father was a fugitive, one of America's most wanted criminals, and wondering if he was alive somewhere thinking about you, or if he died decades ago without ever looking back. The psychological impact of such abandonment is profound. Children of fugitives often struggle with complex feelings. Anger at being left, hope that their parent might return, shame about their parents' crimes, confusion about their own identity. Matthews's children had to navigate all of this while living in the public eye, their father's notoriety, ensuring they could never escape his shadow. Did Matthews ever try to contact them? If so, no evidence of such contact has ever emerged. More likely, he made the decision that any contact would endanger both his freedom and their safety. Law enforcement would watch his family for decades, hoping for exactly such contact. Matthews, if he's as intelligent as his escape suggests, would know this and resist the temptation, no matter how powerful it might be. His children are themselves elderly now, grandparents perhaps, carrying the Matthews name into another generation. They've built lives separate from their father's legacy, careers and families of their own. But the question must always be there, lurking in the background. Is he still alive? Did he ever think about us? Why did he choose freedom over us? These questions will probably remain unanswered. If Matthews dies without revealing himself, his children will never get closure. They'll spend their entire lives wondering, and they'll die wondering. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of Matthews's choice. Not just what it cost him, but what it cost the innocent people he left behind. In 2025, Frank Matthews's story resonates in new ways. The criminal justice reform movement has forced Americans to confront the racism and inequality embedded in the legal system. Mass incarceration has been recognized as a policy failure that destroyed communities without reducing crime. The war on drugs is increasingly seen as a catastrophic mistake that accomplished little except filling prisons with non-violent offenders, disproportionately Black and Hispanic. In this context, Matthews's refusal to submit to the system takes on different meaning. He was a drug dealer who caused real harm. That fact remains unchangeable. But he was also a Black man facing a justice system that has never been just to Black Americans. A system that would have imprisoned him for decades, while white criminals often receive more lenient treatment. His escape can be seen as an act of resistance, however problematic. He refused to accept the fate the system had prepared for him. He chose freedom, even freedom that required giving up his identity over imprisonment. For people who see the criminal justice system as fundamentally broken and racist, Matthews's escape represents a kind of victory, even if it's a victory that came with enormous costs. The comparison to modern fugitives is instructive. In the age of drones and satellites, of facial recognition and biometric tracking, escaping has become virtually impossible. Modern fugitives are typically caught within months, sometimes within days. The technology of surveillance has advanced far beyond what existed in Matthews's era. His escape represents a form of freedom that technology has made obsolete. This makes his story both more impressive and more sad. More impressive because he succeeded against odds that have only gotten worse for subsequent fugitives. More sad because his escape represents the end of an era, the last moment when disappearing was truly possible for someone in his position. Frank Matthews's story forces us to confront deep philosophical questions about identity, freedom, and the price of choice. If you had to choose between 30 years in prison as yourself or 50 years of freedom as someone else, which would you choose? There's no obviously correct answer. Prison preserves your identity, but destroys your freedom. You remain yourself, but that self is caged, controlled, diminished. You can maintain relationships with family, but only through prison walls and supervised visitation. You can tell your story, but only as a cautionary tale of failure and punishment. You're still you, but a broken version of you. Freedom under an assumed identity preserves your liberty, but destroys yourself. You can go where you want, do what you want, but never as yourself. Every relationship is based on a lie. Every achievement belongs to your false identity, not to you. You have freedom, but no authentic existence. You're free, but you don't really exist. Matthews chose freedom, and he's lived with that choice for over 50 years, if he's still alive. Was it the right choice? Only he can answer that question, and he's kept his answer secret for half a century. The rest of us can only speculate about what that life has been like. The loneliness of maintaining a false identity, the constant vigilance required to avoid exposure, the inability to ever fully trust anyone with the truth. The story also raises questions about success and failure in criminal enterprise. By conventional measures, Matthews was enormously successful. He built a vast empire, made hundreds of millions, and escaped when the law came for him. But what does success mean if you can't acknowledge it? If the most successful thing you ever did was becoming someone else entirely? Is achievement real if it can never be recognized? These aren't just abstract philosophical questions. They're the reality Matthews has lived or lived every day since June 26, 1973. He's had 52 years to contemplate whether he made the right choice. We can only imagine his conclusions. Frank Matthews built a 21-state drug empire. He challenged the Italian Mafia's monopoly and won. He made hundreds of millions of dollars. He lived like a king, with mansions and luxury cars and beautiful women. And then he disappeared so completely that 52 years later, no one knows if he's alive or dead, where he went, or what happened to him. His story includes 3 children abandoned, who grew up without their father, countless lives destroyed by drug addiction, communities devastated by the heroin trade he helped expand, a criminal justice system made to look incompetent by his escape, decades of mystery and speculation, a legend that has inspired countless other criminals, an unsolved puzzle that fascinates new generations of true crime enthusiasts. The human cost of his criminal career is incalculable. Every dose of heroin he sold potentially destroyed a life, tore apart a family, contributed to the cycle of addiction and crime that devastated black communities in the 1970s and beyond. This legacy of harm cannot be dismissed or minimized by the romantic mythology that has grown around his escape. Yet his intelligence, organizational ability, and the perfection of his disappearance remain remarkable. He accomplished something no other major criminal in American history has managed: true escape, complete disappearance, freedom maintained for decades. This achievement, however much we might wish it otherwise, is genuinely impressive. The question of whether Frank Matthews succeeded or failed has no simple answer, because it depends entirely on what we value. If we value freedom above all else, he succeeded brilliantly. If we value authentic existence and relationships, he failed catastrophically. If we value justice, his escape is a failure of the system. If we value human resilience and ingenuity, his escape is a triumph. Most likely, the truth is that Matthews both succeeded and failed, that his life contains both triumph and tragedy, that his escape was simultaneously his greatest achievement and his greatest loss. Life is rarely as simple as success or failure, and Matthews's life, both the part we know and the part that remains hidden, is as complex as any in American criminal history. Frank Matthews, Black Caesar, drug kingpin, fugitive, ghost. He remains America's greatest unsolved criminal mystery. He is the man who got away, the one who beat the system, the kingpin who achieved what no other ever has: complete and permanent escape. Whether he's alive or dead, whether his last 50 years have been heaven or hell, whether he regrets his choice or celebrates it every day, we will probably never know. The mystery is his gift to history, a puzzle without a solution, a story without an ending, a question that will be asked but never satisfactorily answered. In the end, perhaps that's exactly what Frank Matthews intended. He didn't just escape from law enforcement. He escaped from narrative itself, from the story that insists all criminals must eventually fall. He wrote his own ending, and he wrote it in invisible ink. We can see the shape of what happened, but the details remain forever obscured. The legend lives on. The search, though largely symbolic now, continues. And somewhere, maybe, Black Caesar smiles at his own myth, the greatest criminal who ever lived, because he's the only one who truly got away. As we close this story, we return to where we began. June 26, 1973. A phone rings in the FBI's New York office. Frank Matthews has vanished, gone, and 52 years later, in 2025, he remains gone. Over half a century has passed. The world Matthews knew has transformed beyond recognition. The technology that might have found him didn't exist when he escaped. The society that produced him has changed, though perhaps not as much as we'd like to think. The drug trade he helped revolutionize has evolved in ways he probably never imagined. But the mystery remains unchanged. Where is Frank Matthews? The question echoes across the decades, unanswered, and probably unanswerable. It's a question that will be asked long after everyone alive today is gone, a permanent fixture in the landscape of American true crime. This is the story of Frank Matthews, the man they called Black Caesar. From Durham to Philadelphia, to Brooklyn to somewhere. From drug dealer to kingpin to ghost. From Frank Matthews to someone else entirely. someone whose name we'll probably never know. He built an empire. He challenged the Mafia. He vanished completely. And whether you view his story as triumph or tragedy, success or failure, inspiration or caution, you cannot deny its singular nature. There has never been anyone quite like Frank Matthews, and given how technology has changed the world, there probably never will be again. He is the one who got away. The mystery endures. The legend lives on. And somewhere, in a grave under a false name, or in a comfortable chair enjoying old age, Frank Matthews has the answer to the question everyone asks, but no one can answer. What really happened to Black Caesar? Good night. Sleep well. And remember, sometimes the best criminals are the ones we never catch.